National incident that revolved around Captain Joshua Huddy and the hanging of Joshua Huddy. So, Tim?
So 3 years ago, Catherine and I were here and we showed you a movie. I didn't make you see the whole movie, but a movie. And at the end, I said sort of parenthetically, oh, the people in Toms River think that this incident resulted in the United States having the Mississippi River as its western border rather than the 1763 line across the top of the Appalachian Mountains. And so Mike set us with a goal of saying, is that true or not? So I grew up in Ocean County. Mike grew up in Toms River. We were told, now this is a quote from the county superintendent from December 29, 1939. He says, the Toms River Black House fight, in all probability, I don't think he was a lawyer, but in all probability, was the first of a line of connected incidents which influenced the peace conference to settle the western boundary of the colonies at the Mississippi River instead of the summit of the Allegheny Mountains. That's what he said, Allegheny, not Appalachia. But anyway, so it's a really hard thing to prove. Now, this is the only place that I could find this assertion. But I grew up with this assertion. This is what we learned. This is the way it was. So there's a new group in our County Historical Society, I know some of you know County Historical Societies, who have determined that this is not true. So is it true or isn't it true? So we're going to do a little bit of investigation. I'm going to give you a conclusion tonight, but there's a lot more research. Like, where did this gentleman get this idea from? So this is before all the 60s and 70s historians. And I looked, and Salter does not make this claim in his book, he's writing in the 1870s, so we have to figure it out. What is the situation? So this is what the argument has been from the people in Ocean County. There was a taking of the blockhouse fight, March 24th, 1782. It sort of, fits the schedule. They capture Huddy. They actually take Huddy to the prison ships in New York Harbor. They take him, so there's the Board of Associated Loyalists, so they're the kind of bad guys, they're under William Franklin. They come over and they get him, and they bring him over, and they hang him without a trial on April 12th. There's a big controversy, and it basically boils down to Black David Foreman. I don't know if you know Black David Foreman out of northern Monmouth County, but he's vicious. And so what happens is that where Monmouth County is now, where now Ocean County used to be part of Monmouth County, they had a vicious revolution, counter-revolution. So what happened was, as Washington is crossing over Fort Lee and going across the state ultimately to get to Valley Forge, the people in Monmouth County, the Loyalists, rise up and have a counter-revolution. Well, David Foreman and his group, which are called the Association of, what did I say the name was, Samantha? Of Retribution. Now that's a pretty good group, right? I don't know whether you want to join that group, but the Association of Retribution, they go in and crush the counter-revolution, and they hang many of the Loyalists from the trees. It's a really bitter war, and it just keeps going. So Joshua Huddy, not to delve too deeply, but this battle, there's a gentleman by the name of Colonel Ty, he's called the Black Caesar. They try to, going back and forth, and so this is so the war is almost over, the peace treaty is in negotiation, and then we get this situation. So the argument is, this guy Lippincott, who is a Board of Associated Loyalists under the British, he is tried, and he is vindicated because he's obeying orders of the Board of the Loyalists, William Franklin, in retribution because Foreman, so Washington owes a great debt to Foreman because Foreman is the one who, from the Highlands, he looks over at New York Harbor, and he's the one who determines that the British Navy is not coming out, and that's when Washington and Rochambeau go down to Yorktown, right? It's really critical. All through the war, it's David Foreman and his guys are keeping track. So Washington feels a real obligation. So according to this theory, then it leads to they have to do retribution, and they take one of, actually from Lancaster County, they take by lot, Quite a story. They picked this guy, Captain Askill. He's supposed to be this wonderful, innocent guy, and his mother appeals to ultimately to Marie Antoinette. This delays the peace negotiations. That's the argument, and then we end up with a separate peace with England, and that part is true. And then that's why we have this border at 1783. So what I focused on, and actually I've never accumulated as much new knowledge as this research project, because in order to determine whether it's slowing the process down, you have to kind of go through the peace process, which is a little difficult. So anyway, so this is, I'm going to show you a little bit of the movie now, not the whole movie, a short piece, but this book is written by the world of self-publishing. We get the creation of some very interesting books that otherwise maybe we wouldn't get. But she is a descendant of Asgills, and she is out to prove that he is a good guy, and also that George Washington is a bad guy. Because when Yorktown, when they surrender, part of the terms that Washington signs is that none of the soldiers who surrender at Yorktown will be used as hostages in any way. That's part of what he says. Now, not to get into a big long story, but Washington sees himself as a Roman. He sees himself as Cincinnatus, right? So, you know the story of Cincinnatus. The Roman army, they defeat I don't know who they were, the Etruscans, whoever they were. They defeat 2 or 3 Roman armies. There's nobody left except old men and young kids. They go to this former official who's on his farm, think Mount Vernon, and then he comes out and he becomes a dictator, and he wins this great victory for the Romans, and which they had no right to win, but he gets all these people together. And then when it's all done, he goes back to his farm. And that's very much in Washington's vision of himself, right? So the fact that he be breaking his word, his bond, is extremely difficult for Washington, and she delves into this in minute detail. So let's see. Next we're going to try to all right, I'm going to show you only the last little bit of the movie. This is a great movie from the it's so bicentennial, it's unbelievable, but the narrator actually used to do it was a Victory at Sea. Right. So here's the attack, the battle's over. These are not very authentic uniforms, but they do burn a whole village down, so it's pretty good.
The British forces have been killed. Privateer Moses Roberts have been hit in the face. The British moved forward. John Wainwright was severely wounded, having been hit 6 times. Sergeant Langdon, who just a short time before had marched through the village, now was dead.
Back in 2007, we found all the people who had been in this movie, and they had aged considerably since this. Okay.
The capture of Captain Joshua Huddy.
Captain Huddy was the mayor at the time.
The renegades, in a cruel act of vengeance, attacked Major Cook, who had taken no part in the battle, and bayoneted him to death. Lieutenant Blanchard of Dillon took Huddy along with the other captured patriots, wounded or not, and loaded them into the boats to be taken to the Sugar House prison in New York.
So at that time, there was an inlet through what we now call Seaside Heights, called Cranberry Inlet, new inlet. So even the troops that would have been in red were really loyalists out of Sandy Hook.
Not content with the success of the attack, the Loyalists lit torches and set fire to the blockhouse.
I don't think any fire marshals would allow this to happen.
Determined to complete their destruction, the renegades helped the British set fire to the buildings in the abandoned village.
Do you know where they set fire to? Mike, was this?
Those are the 3 houses burned up.
No, but I think when they made the movie, they actually built these fronts and set them on fire. They were pretty serious about this. The movie was written, directed, produced all by my predecessor, Tom Miller. Sort of like
The
Citizen
events that
Kane.
were to follow would affect the peace efforts of men from 3 nations. At 10 o'clock on the morning of April 12, 1782, Captain Huddy, who had been taken from the prison in New York and put aboard a British ship, was brought to Gravelly Point on the Navesink, about a mile beyond the Highland Lighthouse.
They had paperwork from the Board of Associated
Contrary to the
Loyalists.
rules of war, decided to use Huddy as an example of their revenge for the executions carried out by the American patriots of British soldiers during the war. They were determined to hang man for man.
But this has really been going on since the beginning of the Revolution. And Huddy was actually part of some of these extra legal hangings himself. But
His hands tied behind him, Huddy was reluctantly brought ashore where a hastily built gallows
he had been
awaited
a Quaker from Salem County, written out of the Quaker Meeting House. We don't know why. The compatriots in Monmouth County wanted a bond so that he married a woman by the name of Hart, who ran a tavern. And it was,
Loyalist Captain Lippincott and the others allowed Huddy to dictate his will. I, Joshua Huddy, being of sound mind and memory, do declare this my last will and testament. I commit my soul into the hands of Almighty God, hoping he may receive it in mercy, and next I commit my body to the earth. He left his good friend, Colonel Samuel Foreman, as his executor.
That's David Foreman's brother, I believe. He said when they were filming this, there were 200 students watching, and he was afraid they might get a little carried away and actually hang
A placard placed around Huddy's neck with the name Philip White on it was symbolic of the Loyalist revenge. Up goes Huddy for Philip White, was shouted in almost jubilant unison. Captain Huddy's last words were, "I shall die innocent, and in a good cause."
So he has an alibi for White's death, but
Having trouble getting his
they were
men to pull the
pretty
rope,
bitter.
took the rope himself. Very soon, poor Huddy was dead.
People did not think of it as poor Huddy until he
taken
came
to
there.
General Washington. The new republic cried out for revenge, and the British were ordered to provide an officer of equal rank, Lieutenant Charles Askill, for hanging in reprisal for Huddy's murder.
So that's not really true. So they didn't supply him, they wouldn't supply him, so they went to Lancaster and took out the
Served no
prisoners.
useful purpose in the cause for freedom. 6 months after the fateful hanging, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams resumed peace negotiations in Paris. The Toms River Blockhouse fight had indeed become an important incident in the fight for independence and aided the Indian Republic in gaining valuable concessions during the Treaty of Peace, which ended the Revolutionary War.
So what he's saying between the lines is this Mississippi River thing, and but there never was really was a cessation in the peace. The only part was that there were 4 peace negotiators. Franklin had, I don't know, they were kidney stones, gallstones, whatever he had, so he was out. John Adams was up in Holland, and the other gentleman was down in Spain. So let's see. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off the story. So I just, when people are remembering, they remember afterwards what they want to remember, and so this woman. Okay, thank you very much. So I mean, there's a lot of details that are just not important to remember. His father was a business person, so he's not from the aristocracy, but he rises, sort of nouveau riche. He has a big scandal when their bank goes bankrupt. But just to show you how detailed this is, she has this diagram where everyone was during the picking of the lottery. So there were 2 choices. One, and the British soldiers refused to participate because they said this is extra legal, we're not going to be part of this. So they had one where they had the names of each of the prisoners, I think there were 13, and they picked out a name, and then they picked out another container, and it either said, I think you're free, or you're not free, and you die. So anyway, so that happens to Aslan. So he does not die. So here's the king and queen of Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette. Apparently I didn't realize, as I say, I think I learned more in this batch of research than I have in a long time. Marie Antoinette was not in favor of the American Revolution. So here's the situation after the French and Indian War. Some people believe that the American Revolution is really an extension of the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War from the European standpoint, and so as some people feel the War of 1812 is a continuation of the same process. So this line here, the 1863 line, is basically the high point of the Appalachian Mountains. And so the colonists were not allowed to go west of that, even though many of them, Daniel Boone, all those kind of people are already out there. Now, after it's all over, the United States ends up being everything to the Mississippi River. There's a big issue with Nova Scotia. They want to take Maine, which is a part of Massachusetts at the time. The Patriots, the Americans they really want all of Canada again. They're not going to get that. And they also want Florida. But one of the issues, let's see the next slide, I think can express this a little bit better. Okay. So one of the things they did, the English reorganized after they took French Canada, and they made what becomes the Northwest Territories part of Quebec. And so one of the things that Ben Franklin in particular is concerned about is that he doesn't want that, when he's talking about making arrangements with Canada, he's concerned about Maine, but he's really concerned about this area, which has been added on. Now, here's the problem. So the French and the Spanish crowns, don't let me get going too far on this because it gets really down in the woods. They're both Bourbons, right? So that when they had restored the monarchy in Spain, it's Charles the 13th, Charles the 3rd, I'm sorry. And so they're very closely aligned, the French and the Spanish. So the real reason isn't because of this Huddy thing. The reason the Americans want to deal with British separately is that the Spanish, and there are very few Spanish, they want everything on the east side of the Mississippi River. They want Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Mississippi, because they want both sides of the river. And so one of the things they realized early on is that the French are not going to turn on their allies. So Ben Franklin has 4 points, and that's a lot of sub-points. He wants full and complete independence. The King George III is really saying that he wants to say, well, you know, we're still friends and we're still relatives. But Franklin says they have to say, we lost, you won, that's the way it is. All British troops out. Settlement with Canada. Nova Scotia wants Maine. Florida and Georgia boundary needs to be fixed. And this western boundary with the Mississippi, the boundaries with Canada, he means that whole thing about the Northwest Territories, and the right to fish on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, which was very important to the New England fishermen. But on June 15, 1781, when Congress, the Continental Congress, approves the treaty process, they tell the 4 negotiators that they have to rely on French guidance in negotiations. Well, at this point in 1781, the Americans would agree to anything, right? Because this is before Yorktown. And so they get stuck in this dilemma that should they, in fact, follow this instruction or do what they want, they end up doing what they want. While all this is going on in France, Madison has to fight a back battle where they want to pull the negotiators back. So this is the famous painting from the peace treaty, right? And the reason it's unfinished is because they were supposed to put the English negotiators in, but the English negotiators say, we're not going to be in a painting that's going to humiliate us the rest of our lives. So they wouldn't do that. So it's John Jay, and it's Adams, right? It's next. And then Franklin, and wait a minute, the other guy's name. Lawrence, Henry Lawrence. And the British were represented by this Richard Oswald and David Hart. Now, I have to say, it was really hard following this in the book because everybody's cheating and everybody's spying on each other. In fact, so when the French said that they helped support the American Revolution, they sent their ambassador, and the ambassador sat in on the congressional all the meetings, all the committee meetings. He was there. It was sort of like maybe a banana republic or something where the corporation is there at the peace treaty, right? So and the rumors were, and so the names of most of the books I have. So everybody thinks from Yorktown through that it's kind of a piece of cake. Well, it's not, because what the British developed this strategy, actually George III is big in this, is that if they wait long enough, kind of like the Ukraine situation, that the Americans will change their minds, and then we can take it all over again. They also thought about, because the 13 colonies were like 13 independent countries, they thought they maybe could peel off 1 or 2 of them to remain part of England. I mean, George III had this thing thought through, right? And the other thing was that they thought the French ambassador was paying all the people on the Congress. And in fact, Thomas Paine is supposed to have been taking money from the French. So this is really complicated, and really, they're all spying on each other. Remember that Mad Magazine, I Spy? Spy versus Spy. So John Jay, who I have to say, the only time I had to really encounter John Jay was reading the Federalist Papers, right? He's the guy, he's the hero of this whole thing. And he was the person down with Spain, and so when Ben Franklin is sick, John Jay has to do the thing. So John Adams doesn't really like anybody. So he's up with the Dutch. He makes a treaty with them. They're going to give us some money. It's a kind of a weird thing because he's going to loan the Americans $2 million, but the Americans owe so much in Europe that it all gets absorbed. But anyway, so he's really the hero. So when John Adams comes down, he says, are these his terms? And he assumes that they're Ben Franklin's terms, so he says, this is garbage. I'm not going to participate at all. Finds out that, in fact, Ben Franklin did not write the terms. It was John Jay. He said, oh, they're pretty good ideas. So this is pretty... So there's lots of bad stuff happening. France is bleeding funds. They are just they're going down. They're going down, really down. A few years later, 15 years later, they're in the French Revolution. They have to declare bankruptcy. They have to bring the Estates General together. The Continental Congress has no money to pay troops for 3 years. The threat of revolution, now, so at this point, Washington is up at Newburgh, which I think is up towards West Point, right? And they have this big meeting where they come in and they say, well, we're going on strike. So everybody says, well, everybody trusts Washington. Washington, because he thinks he's Cincinnatus, no one's paying him from the government. No one's not paying him, excuse me, from the government. So they say, well, you're not, you're rich, you're not one of us. Vermont, where Mike went to school, wants to become a 14th colony. They're claiming parts of New York. They're claiming parts of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. They're like completely out of control. A lot of the loyalists are going up there because it's kind of closer to Canada. The French ambassador is being accused of paying off the members of Congress. But the thing that really, really changes everything is that the Prime Minister of England has to have a meeting. And when he has this meeting, if he doesn't have a peace treaty, he's going to be out. He's not going to be the Prime Minister anymore. So he's pushing. The French fleet, which had done this great thing at Yorktown. I mean, I'm sure you guys have read, Trafalgar, all these things, right? The French are always losing to the British. One of the reasons is they built all these ships during the Revolutionary War. They didn't have any seamen. They didn't have any trained seamen, so they were just getting guys out of the wheat field to be on the boat. They had no idea what they were doing on the boat, so they lost all these battles, right? So when the fleet leaves Yorktown, goes down into the Caribbean to really win the battle, at the Battle of the Santines, they lose miserably to the English. So nobody is in good shape. Savannah has fallen at this point. This is I did not know the story about the American Revolution. So one of the things in between the Loyalists, which all of this does have a lot of impact on the Loyalist treatment, was what happens to the African Americans who have sided with the British. The British are promising them freedom, right? So what they do is they get on the boat at Savannah, and the slaves are hanging on the ship. It's a good thing you've all eaten. It's just absolutely horrible. They're pushing them off the ship. So they bring about 200 or 300 of them to this little island off of Savannah, and they put them on the island. They say, we'll be back for you tomorrow. They never come back, and 200 or 300 people starve who had put their faith behind the British. And so, now, another thing that's very important to remember is that why did Spain join the battle? So they're Bourbons, that's a big thing. But the real reason is that the Spanish want Gibraltar. So they have a siege for 3 years to take Gibraltar, and that's all they care about is taking Gibraltar. They have an empire all over the world. English have an empire all over the world. So finally there's a fleet of ships coming from London to come down and relieve Gibraltar. 3 years. So the Spanish and the French, they make these barges with all these cannons. They don't design them very well. And so they get too close. And when the British hit their ship, it blows up and they're all dead. So by the time the relief ship comes, there's no fleet. So this really, so all these things are happening, pushing towards the peace treaty. I had no idea. Anyway, Gibraltar is considered the jewel in the crown, which later they call India, right? Oh, and the French and British are still fighting in India. So, now this Comte de Grasse, I think that's how you pronounce his name, I don't know, maybe close. He's the gentleman who loses the big battle in the Caribbean. I should have quit while he was ahead. This is this Lord Shelburne, who's the Prime Minister. They're going to really be tough on the Americans, but he needs that vote. And so he's ready to negotiate. This is the French ambassador who's paying off all these people. The Dutch, John Adams, so the English declared war on Holland for some reason. They don't know why they did it, but so John Adams is able to negotiate with them. He gets this $2 million loan. It's used to pay off debts. It's not helping because the Continental Congress is, the soldiers, they send a delegation, they're ready to have a coup. I mean, they're ready to come and just take over. And they haven't eaten it. No one has given them any food. Nobody's giving them any money. They're really upset. So finally, we get this treaty on November 30th, 1782. The final treaty, it's almost word for word the same. The Americans just don't change what they're demanding. They get the Mississippi boundary, they get the access to fishermen. What they have to do is find an American fisherman who's in like Marseille or someplace, bring him up to Paris, and have him explain that the only way you can get cod is to catch the cod on the Great Banks and go on shore and salt them so that you can get like 4 times as much fish in the boat, right? So they say, oh, we understand why you need that. That's okay, I will do that. So the key sticking point is the abandonment of the Loyalists. Now this is where the Huddy affair has a big impact. Because remember, who is the head of the board of Associated Loyalists? William Franklin. So this really embarrassed. Now, meanwhile, somehow Ben Franklin's not having these gallstones anymore, or whatever's going on. He's now part of the whole process. And they said, you mean my son had something to do with this guy Huddy? This guy Huddy is like, he's part of this association of retaliation. Like, I don't want anything to do with my son. Oh, it gets really interesting. They said, oh, well, you're going to have to, the British say to the Americans, you're going to have to pay the Loyalists for everything that you burned or took from them. And the Americans say, okay, everything that you bombed or blew up while you were in America, you're going to have to pay for it. The British said, well, maybe that's not exactly what we meant. So in the end, there is nothing for the Loyalists. There's nothing. They turn it over to the states, and that is a direct result of the Huddy hanging. This December 5th, 1782, it's sort of like, I never heard this before, but this is supposed to be like the shot heard around the world. The King of England, they read from the address that's been written by their prime minister, he has to say, we lost the war, America is independent. And they say that he stopped, he choked on it, he just really had a lot of trouble with it, but it got done. March 12th, so in the stories I tell about Cedar Bridge, I keep saying, oh, the war is almost over, they're having a battle at Cedar Bridge. That's not really what's going on. When they do this preliminary peace treaty, no one knows the terms. Oh, the spies know whatever, but the public doesn't know anything. So they don't actually send a copy of the preliminary peace treaty to Philadelphia for the Continental Congress until March 12th of 1783. Meanwhile, Lafayette, who's been saying, you know, is the hero, right, of the revolution for us, he is now putting together a force of 25,000 men from Cadiz, and they're going to sail to the Caribbean, take Jamaica, and then work their way up. They're going to go to Charleston, free them. They're going to go to New York and take care of them. That misses by 2 days sailing, because once they sailed in those days, you couldn't recall them, right? You couldn't bring them back. So that never happened. Edmund Burke helps. The stuff that goes on is really pretty bad. So meanwhile, France is really PO'd that they were left out, because now Ben Franklin is back as the main negotiator, and they say, well, you know, you weren't supposed to do this treaty without talking to us. Oh, yeah, we forgot. That was, you know, sure, well, that was way too bad. By the way, can you give us $6 million? So, because there's no money in the Congress. They're ready to have a coup. They're ready to have a military takeover, right? So finally, they relent after whatever, going back and forth. And so the French send like a couple $100,000 over. But so France, England, and Spain sign a peace treaty. So what's kind of interesting is that, to get back to the map here. So during the French and Indian War, Florida had become a British possession. So the Spanish said they would not settle unless they had Gibraltar. Well, after this 3-year siege that falls apart, they don't have any bargaining position at all. So they say, well, okay, you can keep Gibraltar. And you give us Florida, and oh, by the way, that thing in India, you can have all India. We don't want India anymore. And they're like, wow, that's a pretty deal, right? Just so happens that, unbeknownst to anybody, the Maharaji, or whoever he was, that was on the French side, he had died. His son was a real wastrel, so they were going to lose it anyway. So finally, here, this is a political cartoon. So this is George III and Lord Shelburne, and They are being accused of selling out to the Americans, and then two men representing France and Spain are leading them with a rope, while another man labeled America scourges them with a whip. So, it's quite a thing. No, so finally, the British leave New York City, right, and evacuate. And then George Washington comes in on November 25th. How many men do you think George Washington had with him? He had his whole army. 750 guys. That's all he could muster. Everybody else had gone home. So, it's not a funny story, but it's an ironic story. So, there was part of this thing, right? So, Clinton goes back to England, Cornwallis goes back to England, ends up in India. And so the fellow they put in charge in New York comes up with this really clever plan. And what he starts doing is letting go of his prisoners. So Livingston is our governor, right? His son was being held captive in New York. So what happens is he lets all these people go, and they go up to New Bern, and they think what's going to happen is Washington's going to say, hey, you've been in 3 years in prison, go on home, right? They don't say that. They say, get to it with your unit, you got to stay here. So what they did when they went to the units, they said, you know, the British actually treated us better than you're getting treated by Continental Congress. Maybe really you should be making a peace with the British. So after a little while, Washington writes a letter to Tarrington and says, don't give us any more prisoners back because it's causing problems. But it was a pretty clever concept. They were sending them back, and that is it. So in my opinion, the Huddy affair is an international incident. There's lots and lots of documentation about that. This Asgill, they make plays in London and Paris. He's like thought of as being this poor, innocent guy. Later he becomes a real scoundrel. He leaves his wife. He goes bankrupt. He's a real wastrel. But anyway, during this time he's a great hero, right? And this thing with the Loyalists, I think it was significant in the Loyalists being completely cut off by the British, which I think made Ben Franklin pretty happy because he was pretty upset with his son. So anyway, anybody have any questions? I know that's quick, and I'm sure I made lots of mistakes, but I was really amazed. I did not know this story, so.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
Very interesting.